Is humanity doomed to collapse or extinction? If so, how do we prepare ourselves spiritually and practically for what's yet to come? If it's not too late, what can we still do? Or maybe you think this whole collapse extinction stuff is pure hyperbole. Well, wherever you are on this issue, you must listen to this podcast, where we will help you see what may actually happen and what may be required of all of us to make doom less doomy, or maybe even come together to create a better future. With our guest, Brian McLaren, author of the compelling book, Life After Doom. You don't want to miss this podcast. So Alain, today we're going to explore a topic we've covered really a number of times in this podcast over the last 2 years about the situation that humanity and the planet face right now, the path that we're on to potential collapse, and really how thoughtful people can respond to the situation we're in, both practically and spiritually. And I have to make a confession. When it was first suggested to us that we interview Brian McLaren, author of this new book, Life After Doom, I have to admit I was a little skeptical, because I've read a lot of books about the future and how we might respond spiritually and practically to this moment. And I'm pretty versant on all the big issues facing us, from war and peace to climate and environment, ocean acidification, and all those things. So my wife, when she saw the book on my desk, said, "John, please don't read that book. You are doomy enough already." But I have to make a confession. The book got me. And it got me because I felt it was a warm, human, beautiful conversation about this moment that we're in. And it not only helped me to think differently about some of what may be ahead of us, but also how we might respond to it internally and collectively. So as it turns out, I'm really excited. It turned out to touch me in a deep way. And I'll say it right at the beginning. I recommend you get the book. I already have to a number of people, and I hope you'll get it. And Brian is the one narrating it, which is also beautiful. But before I invite Brian in, I do have to say one more thing. We're recording this the day after Charlie Kirk was assassinated at that college in Utah. And first of all, we want to send our prayers and our thoughts out to his wife, his 2 young children, and everyone who knew him personally. This is a tragic day in a sad day in an increasingly sad country, where we really have come to the point where we're trying to solve our differences, whether it's a Minnesota legislator who was killed in her home in Minnesota, or this latest tragedy, and it has to stop. And later in this podcast, I'm not going to start there. I even have a question about whether all this conversation about doom from both sides is part of what's contributing to this fiery environment that we're in. But first, just our hearts go out. This is a tragedy, whatever your political position, whether you loved or despise the ideas of Charlie Kirk, there is no place for this in our society, and it's not going to make a great way forward. So, welcome to the podcast. You know, we explore the big challenges facing humanity and planet here, and ask forward thinkers to ask, where can we go from here? So Brian, welcome into the studio. We're thrilled to have you.
I'm so thrilled to be here, and so glad that conversations like this are happening.
So Brian, when I read your book, I was struck by your own personal journey from growing up in a very conservative Christian family, becoming a pastor in a conservative church, and then your series of epiphanies, which led in part to your book, Everything Must Change. So could you talk to us a little more about this journey?
Yes, well, Alain, I grew up in a sort of a typical conservative Christian family, but of course, I was born in 1956, so it was typical of the 50s and 60s and 70s. Right. And things have changed in all of these settings since then. But I was a good kid. I listened to the sermons and went to Sunday school class, and I believed what I was told. And then as I got older, I started having questions about the particular version of Christianity that I had inherited. And I remember I was taught that our version is the only right version. So if you reject our version, none of the others are worth anything. So what that sort of did for me is give me this feeling it's an all or nothing thing. It's either my version or I'm a total, unbelieving, ungodly, anti-religion atheist, And that was, of course, a false dichotomy, but that was my starting point. And so I ended up, and that created no little anxiety because my religious upbringing told me if I changed my beliefs, and we had a pretty long list of beliefs and a pretty narrow path that you had to be on to be among the saved, that I would be in hell forever. So it's pretty high stakes, but I was fortunate to first come across some books that really helped me. Second, to come across some people who really helped me. And third, I had some experiences that also helped me to find a path through that. And where I still am a person of deep faith, I still consider myself a Christian, but a different kind of Christian than that kind that was my only option growing up. And one of the shifts that happened in my thinking is my religious background told me that the whole purpose of life, in fact, not only the purpose of life, the purpose of the universe is to create souls so they could be sorted out between heaven and hell. And once I lost that framing, it made me look at the Gospels in the New Testament again. And I noticed that Jesus kept talking about this thing called the kingdom of God. For me, I'd been taught that meant heaven after you die. But it became clear, like in the Lord's Prayer, we don't say, may we go to heaven when we die. We say, may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth. So a concern for the earth suddenly became more important to me, which in a way made so much sense because if God is the creator and God loves creation, we should be concerned about creation too. And that led me in 2006 and 2007 to write a book called Everything Must Change that you mentioned, where it was the first time I sort of took my faith and said, what does my faith have to say to global crises? And that I'm happy when people tell me that book changed their lives, but it also changed my life and led really to the writing of Life After Doom in 2024.
I almost want to say I'm sorry in a way, Brian. And I grew up in a very liberal Presbyterian church in New York City. And I always feel like I had the opposite. Interesting. I was an active minister as you were. And, the opposite, it was really that the kingdom is here and now and pick up your cross and serve because
yes.
The earth is sacred and all of life is sacred. But we all come from that different place. And now I'm probably very similar to some of your spiritual inclinations. And we want to talk later about how we bring the Christian community into this conversation. We're going to get there in a little bit. I think it's very important. So folks, stay with us because one of the things I'm struck as you kind of hint in your book that there may not be a path forward in the United States if we can't bring them into the coalition. But I want to first step back to some of the basics in your book. Mm-hmm. I love earlier in your book, you said, quote, climate change is the toxic cherry on top of a global mess of problems we face. And it resonated with me personally because I feel some people are over-focused on carbon. They think if we just can stop emitting so much carbon, the world would just be this beautiful place and the future will be promising. Can you just say very briefly, in your mind, because I thought it was a very important point, what are, in your mind, that global mess of problems? Again, just not in great detail,
Sure.
That's underneath the cherry of climate change.
Sure. Well, let me give just two words that if people understand these words, it will really help them, I think, sort this through. The first is a word that a fellow named William Catton introduced, I think, in the 1970s in a book called Overshoot. And the idea of overshoot is very simple. If we suck out too many resources from the earth faster than the earth can replenish them, and if we pump out too many waste products, toxins, pollutants faster than the earth can detoxify them, we take out too much and we pump out too much. If we do that, every generation, children inherit an earth that's poorer and dirtier and less balanced and more in danger than their parents inherited. And so that idea of overshoot is the first idea. If we solve the carbon problem without solving the overshoot problem, our children are still in trouble. And then the second word is multi-crisis or polycrisis. This is a word that a lot of people are using now because what they're realizing is we have a whole series of problems, each of which is significant, each of which makes the other problems more difficult to solve. And if we understand that, then we say, okay, solving one problem at a time won't help us. All the other problems will gang up on the systems to keep that problem going. So we have to look for deeper solutions that will affect the whole. And in my mind, those deeper solutions are on what we might call the spiritual level, meaning what are our values? What's the story we're living in? How do we want to show up as people? And those deeper questions, I think, interestingly, at a time when religion is being discredited most of all by religious people themselves, this points to this spiritual need that I think is more intense than ever.
I think you're so right. And I like the way you put that, which is first, there's the technical side of things, which is overshoot that is bigger than just carbon. We're overshooting in fishing the oceans. We're overshooting in deforestation. You can go on, right? We're overshooting in terms of our financial system, et cetera. We're overshooting in a military, right? Still inventing new and better ways to kill each other. And I loved in the book, you reminded us, we're still 30 minutes away from the end of the world as we know it. One button gets pushed by accident or on purpose. And that's still out there too. And Gaza and Ukraine remind us of just how fiery this is. But couldn't agree with you more that the answer then is this deeper spiritual quest of who we are and who we are to each other and who we are to the rest of the planet.
Yes.
And it doesn't feel like that's the conversation that we're having most of the time, does it?
No, that's right. And there are reasons for that. One of them being that one of those many crises is that a very small number of very, 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 very rich people, I mean, people who are rich beyond what most of us can imagine, there are a small number of them who want not only all the power they have through their wealth, but then they want to own media, and then they want to control governments, and they want to create alliances among themselves to increase their shared power. And I've come to believe that what a person goes through to achieve that much wealth and power changes the way they think. Their vision becomes more and more narrow. You might say it becomes narcissistic. They only care about themselves, and they only see the world measured by the value of money and power and winning and losing, that sort of thing. And the irony is a whole lot of us who have a lot less money, maybe less education, maybe, all the rest, we have a little more common sense than that. And we have this, I think, need now to try to get those of us who have some of that common sense to try to build a shared identity, and then to organize and build movements that help counter that concentrated wealth and power among a few people.
Yeah, thank you for pointing to that dimension. Some people have called it the meta crisis.
Yes.
Which is a crisis of worldview. In indigenous circles, they talk about wetico, which is this greed, self-aggrandizement, etc.
Yes.
And that seems to be quite at work. But going back to the book, you talk about 4 possibilities facing us in a framework that I found very helpful. Collapse avoidance, collapse rebirth, collapse survival, and collapse extinction. I like that all of them have the word collapse in them, because in some ways it's already collapsing right now. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about these briefly and why you think these distinctions matter?
Yes. So when I've been reading on this back since I originally wrote that book in 2006, 2007, Everything Must Change. And then in the last 5 years, I just immersed myself more and more to try to understand all of kind of the state of the art thinking in all of this. And one of the contributions, one of the struggles I had is I felt like people couldn't be clear about what the future might hold. And what that tended to do is say it's either business as usual or extinction. And I felt like, it's a little more complicated than that. So I created these 4 scenarios. The first scenario, collapse avoidance, says we will get our act together enough to stop collapse from happening. We'll come together enough of us with enough of the good ideas. We'll create a critical mass to turn things. And that's what I think when I wrote Everything Must Change in the early 2000s. The purpose of that book was to help us achieve collapse avoidance. But 20 years have passed, and in every indicator, in almost every indicator, we're farther away from that tipping point happening than we were even then. So that leads to these other three scenarios that involve a collapse of civilization. And the first thing people need to understand is our civilization is super, super complex. It is super, super resilient, yet it is super, super fragile. And we can maintain equilibrium, but there comes a point where equilibrium begins to disintegrate. I personally think, and it sounds like you feel the same way on that, and John, that we're watching the early stages of the loss of equilibrium. So the second scenario is that some form of collapse happens. Now, collapse normally doesn't happen all at once. I mean, if a mega asteroid hits the Earth, it happens on one day. But if we look at past civilizational collapses, they usually happen in what we might call a stair-step fashion. Things are going well, and then they take a big step down. And we think, okay, we've hit bottom. No, they take another step down and then another. So that, when you ask, when did the Roman Empire end? Well, it's hard to give a date, and different people give different dates because it was a long flight of stairs that people fell down. But that we will go down to a level that will wake us up, and then we will make the changes that need to be made. And there could be a kind of rebirth of civilization. That's scenario 2. Scenario 3 says, no, we're not smart enough, or we don't pull together enough to do that. And so it gets worse and worse and worse. And then we reach a bottom where the human species survives, but civilization as we know it doesn't survive. And we end up surviving at a level that might be more similar to ancient hunter-gatherers or early feudal societies, but it's very, very different from anything that we would call civilization. Drastically reduced population and drastically reduced complexity of our social and economic life. That's the third scenario. And then the fourth scenario is on the way down. Human beings could take desperate enough actions. It could be nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, a whole lot of things that could actually lead to the extinction of our species. And for people who think, oh, that could never happen, let me just say this as a cautionary tale. If we took the oil companies of the world right now and took the land that they have purchased, that they want a good return on investment so that they could suck all the oil out and burn it and put it, oil and natural gas, and put it in the atmosphere, that would raise the global temperature something like 6 or 7 degrees Celsius. It would raise the average global temperature to levels that would create a mass die-off. It wouldn't just be human beings that go extinct. It would be a huge percentage of land, vertebrate life, and ocean life. So just as we already have enough nuclear weapons to destroy us, we now have fossil fuel companies with enough carbon to destroy us in another way. We have 2 different ways of destroying ourselves right now. So those are the 4 scenarios. And then the last thing I should say about this is that people ask me, which scenario do you think is likely? And I honestly think, first of all, I don't know. Secondly, I think it's dangerous to choose a scenario, especially scenario 1 or scenario 4, and say you think that's what it's going to be, because both of those scenarios take you out of the realm of action. What I think we need is a realm of action rather than a realm of, well, here's what's going to happen. Everything's fine. We don't need to do anything or worry about it. Or here's what's going to happen. There's no hope. So why even try? That's to me the danger of, and why I think having 4 scenarios is better than just 2.
And, Brian, I think it is a lovely framework for 2 reasons. One is that it makes sense, because this idea that the people who say human beings are going to go extinct, we're going to ruin the planet, we don't know if that's going to happen. Of course, that's possible. People who say we're going to avoid it, right? And all is going to be well. It's always been well. we don't know that, right?
Yeah.
And in Zen they talk about the don't know mind, right? The
Yes.
importance of not.
Yes.
But you're also pointing out how practical not knowing is. And one of the things you say in the book that I'll say, if you read the book, you'll see it's a beautiful part where you talk about optimism and despair are equally dangerous because of what you just said. If we're optimistic, we're going to be able to avoid it, we'll be complacent.
Yeah.
Because something's going to happen. These other things are possibilities. If you're in the we're doomed camp, that can lead you to complacency. All we have to do now is be nice to each other and figure out how we're going to handle it when it comes. And that means we won't do anything. So because we don't know, and that's and I think the important thing you're saying is no one does know. Yes. If you're a doomster, a complete doomster, there's no scientist who says that's the only path we can be on. If you're an optimist, there is no scientist who says that's the only path we can be on. All these things could happen. So I think it's a very helpful model.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to talk a little bit about this issue of Christianity, and I'm going to turn it over to Alain to ask that question, because I think it's one of the unique things that you bring to this conversation is your rootedness in the church and your continued being a part of it in a variety of ways. So Alain, why don't you take this one?
Yes, Brian, in the US, Christianity is oddly at the center of resistance to doing anything about climate and the environment. You tell a story about speaking at a Southern Baptist convention and a bit of the feeling of futility. When you asked a colleague why he still speaks there, he said that the path forward runs right through conservative Christianity. What do you make of this? And is there hope of that happening?
Yes. So I hope we have some people who would identify themselves as conservative Christians listening. And I'm sure it's very shocking for them to hear someone say that some of us think that conservative Christianity is a problem, because when you're brought up in conservative Christianity, you're constantly told we're the solution, everybody else is the problem. And so I hope that people who might feel that way will hear me saying, and hear all three of us saying, we are not saying you're bad people. We're saying that something has happened to your version of faith that could have been very, very helpful in past generations. But now it's the situation has changed in a number of ways. And one way I think I can, this is not the whole story, but it's a little piece of the story that people who identify as conservative Catholic or conservative Protestant or conservative Eastern Orthodox, that they could understand. I could say this: the same super rich people who give money to politicians to get the politicians to pass laws that will help them make more money, and the same super rich people who try to control media, whether it's cable news stations or newspapers or social media platforms, they give money to try to influence public opinion so that the public will support policies that help them make even more money. They also are the people, and they're influencing the people who give money to churches. And when they give that money to churches, they help maintain in the church an unwillingness to be political, unless it's political in a way that serves the interests of that major donor class of people. And if someone says, oh, you're being very, very cynical, there's so much evidence for this. In fact, a very popular book was just written that details some of this over the last, few years. It's a book that just came out in the last year. So I can just tell you, you could do research and find out that I'm speaking the truth. And in this way, if you're a conservative Christian, I'm telling you that Jesus was really, really right when he said, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve both God and money. I'm telling you, he was right when he said that. And the power of the super rich who have the most money to take us in a certain direction is very, very great. Now, let me add one thing if I could. You mentioned Americans, Alain, and we Americans have a lie that we tell ourselves, or a truth that we don't let ourselves face. And that is, our religion took shape during genocide of one race and attempted genocide of the indigenous people, probably 12 or 13 million people who were here that we reduced over a couple of centuries and very nearly committed genocide. Thank God some survived, and thank God for indigenous people who are still here. And then through the enslavement of another race. So what we did, American religion has a long tradition of letting money win. In fact, a scholar, friend of mine, brilliant scholar named Kelly Burton, says America was a business before it was a nation. And so the power of money is very, very great. And that's maybe where I would start on that, Alain.
One of the things, so many things popping in my mind now, so I'll do a quick stream of consciousness, then deepen a question with you, is first that coalitions are interesting things. A friend of mine said the other day, if you are not uncomfortable most of the time in a coalition you're in, most of the time, you are not in a coalition that's broad enough. So I feel like one of the great challenges is we now have a coalition of issues that have all come together.
Yeah.
So if you're a Christian, especially a conservative Christian, access to guns, capitalism, being against abortion, being against big government, being against climate change and treating the earth well is now a giant package, right? And if you're a progressive person, you have your own set, of giant packages, trans rights, pro-choice, social equity, et cetera. And I feel like one of the things we ought to be trying to do, and I'd love to talk to you about this off the podcast sometime, maybe do another one on that, is how do we build a coalition with Christian, especially conservative Christians, just around the earth? Saying, look, the earth is sacred. God gave us dominion over it. But as you point out in your book, that word dominion was really more the way an earthly king would treat a kingdom. It was to be the caretaker of it, right? So I feel sometimes, we don't have to unpack that right now, that one of the problems is we're afraid, even of the progressive side, of building a broader coalition. We feel like people have to be with us on every issue. And I think we make a mistake trying to reach out to Christians and try to get them to with us on all these other issues, when I think we could get them with us on the earth. Do you think I'm right at all about that?
My really honest answer is I don't know. I'm unclear on this myself.
That's good to say. I don't know, right?
Yeah, this isn't saying I think you're right or wrong. It's just, I think this is a very important question, and I'll add one thing to it. I think our current left and right arguments are both left and right are shaped within a framework that I think is part of the problem. And if I'll get a little bit nerdy for just a second.
No, go, please. This is an important topic, I think.
But left and right, in many ways, are economic categories that then take on different issues to really fight economic battles. And there is no reason why socialism should be pro-abortion and capitalism should be anti-abortion. It's just right now that in creating those different coalitions you talked about, the sort of ultra-capitalist forces have found they can build a good alliance with anti-abortion forces and vice versa. But here's the thing. If we trace back capitalism and socialism to their two of their founders, for capitalism, Adam Smith, and to socialism, let's say we go back to Karl Marx. If we trace back to them, they were having an argument about how to build the best society that's based on overshoot. In other words, is it better to exploit the earth through the methods of capitalism or through the methods of socialism? But they're both about exploiting the earth. Neither of those economic systems considers the earth as a finite resource, or not even a resource, considers the earth as our home of which we are part and what we belong to. So my suspicion is that what we really need going forward is a vision that breaks out of that bubble into a bigger vision. It's in many ways a more ancient vision. I think it's more of the indigenous vision, but it's also a deeply spiritual vision. And so I know a little bit theoretical and esoteric, but I think that makes sense, based on the way you phrased the question to me.
Yeah, thanks.
So one of the most beautiful lines in this book is, I am an activist because I am in love. And I think that's connected to what you just said, is where
Yes.
do I come from? Do I come from a sense of separation, or do I come from a sense of unity and belonging to something much larger?
And of course, for any of us who identify as Christians, suddenly you hear someone asking Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Like, what's our most important moral guideline or absolute or North Star or whatever? What's our most important moral principle? And Jesus says, love God. Let's step back on this. Love God. Love, the source of love that loves all of creation, and love your neighbor as yourself. So in loving God, you get God and creation. And in loving your neighbor, you get your neighbor and yourself. And so now we have this love that is our framework. And that's why, even though I see many current power coalitions of Christianity that in many ways have become, without even knowing it, they've become servants of an ideology, an economic ideology. They don't realize the degree to which what they think is Christianity with a capitalist bumper sticker is actually capitalism with a Christian bumper sticker, might be a way to say it. And by the way, it's not that I'm saying the socialist car or truck with a Christian bumper sticker is the answer. I think we need something deeper. And it's this vision that is truly Christian in this sense. It says Jesus was right. The greatest moral imperative is to approach the world with the love that the Creator approaches the world. That includes the earth, my neighbor, myself.
Picking up on that, Brian, one of the most fascinating parts of your book, I think, for the reader, especially someone who has a certain view of the Judeo-Christian tradition, is you said that the Judeo-Christian scriptures are a form of indigenous wisdom. You went as far as to say, and I love this line, the characters of the Bible, including God, I see as kidnapped victims of the colonizers, the very ones the characters fought against. It's a very provocative idea, and I think truthful. Say a little bit about that, because it really relates to what you just said about, in a way, capitalism and the power structure kidnapped the Judeo-Christian tradition, which bared so much resemblance to other indigenous wisdom traditions, but most because we associate it with the power structure in the Western society. We've forgotten what it actually was. So don't go into too much detail, but give us a flavor for that, because I think it's a really provocative way to look at the Judeo-Christian tradition that is not looked at very often in our society.
Yeah, okay, I would love to. And let me try to do this very briefly. First, I need to give just some advice to people in what I'm about to say. I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty, and I'm not trying to make good guys and bad guys. I'm trying to make like an observation, just like some people are left-handed, some people are right-handed, some people have hair, some people are lucky like me to be hair-free. But I'm not making any judgments here. But we could say this. There are two kinds of people who live on the earth. Indigenous people believe to their bones that they belong to the earth. Colonizers believe to their bones that the earth belongs to them. If we go back far enough, all people were indigenous people. Everyone was part of a tribe, hunter-gatherers or pastoralists or early agriculturalists who were connected to the earth. They had a patch of ground that they'd inherited. Either their family or their tribe had been living on that ground for generations, all the generations people could remember. And they expected that their children and grandchildren, as many generations as they could imagine, they were connected to the ground. The well-being of the earth was connected to their well-being. And then another kind of human being developed. And probably one indigenous tribe conquered another indigenous tribe. And decided to use them as either slaves or vassals. And then their relationship was changed to the earth. Now the earth belongs to them, and they can take more land and more land and more land and become more and more powerful. The indigenous people survive through a mutually enhancing relationship with the earth. The colonizers survive by dominating other people and dominating pieces of the earth. Very different ways of looking at the world. And my proposition is that the Jewish people were indigenous people who were being colonized by many different nations, and they did not want to be anybody's colony, and they didn't want to be anybody's dominating master. They just wanted to live in peace on their land. And I mean, that's so obvious, right? In one sense, if you look at Jewish history, it's so obvious, but it's something I've been a preacher my whole life. I only began to see in maybe the last 5 years, it's gradually become clear. And now I'll just tell you, when I read the Bible with that as my framework, the Bible I've always loved the Bible, but it makes more sense than it's ever made. One little PS to that. I have a group of friends who are rabbis, and they're part of a group called Trua. And their little motto, they have this on a T-shirt. I'd love to get the T-shirt. It says, "Resisting tyrants since Pharaoh." and this is part of the Jewish identity properly understood. Obviously, there are many Jews today who have forgotten their indigenous identity as well, and have joined the colonizers in their tactics and values. But to me, this is deeply embedded in our faith.
And then Jesus then brings, I'll say it in a silly way, a softer and gentler version of the Old Testament scriptures. But he himself is a revolutionary, a reactionary against power, against, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth. Easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle, which was a place in Jerusalem, than it is to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so if someone asks for your cloak, give them your shirt too, turn the other cheek. And so that Jesus, that Christianity, that Judeo-Christian tradition got kidnapped by the power structure. And I think you make the point, it is now being kidnapped by the capitalist religion. And you talk in the book about capitalism is a religion. We know it's a religion because people who profess it say there is no other way. We don't even need to explore a new way because capitalism is the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz said. And so these things have all been enmeshed together. And I think what I would say to believers, people from a Judeo-Christian background, is reread the scriptures with those eyes, reread the gospels with those eyes, and then see, does it mesh with the capitalism as we practice it? I'm not saying we should go to communism, and that didn't work, right? But there's a different kind of system that could emerge, but not until we really look at the tradition as it is will we maybe be open to that.
So much we could say about that. I couldn't agree more. But this is one of our problems, going back to that idea from Zen that you mentioned of having a beginner's mind, or of not thinking we know it all, or of being able to say, I don't know. What if the form of life that is needed is going to take 2 generations or 3 generations to get there? Unfortunately, I think it might take 10 or 12, and I'm not sure how bad things will be by that time. But let's imagine 2 or 3. What that means is it's not like the 3 of us know what the answer is, and we can tell everybody, and it might take 3 generations to get there. It might be we need 3 generations of watching things that we assume are inevitable and eternal and unchangeable, watching those things crumble to change our thinking enough that another way of life would even be possible, right? Like, for example, if we had walked up to Jesus or Paul or Mary in the first century and said, hey, there's this idea called democracy, that would have been so far away from where they were that it wasn't like democracy was an option that Jesus would preach. But he did go in this direction. He says, the Gentiles, meaning the Roman Empire, the colonizers, they call themselves benefactors when really they're just ruling over each other. It's all about domination for them. He says it shouldn't be this way about you. The greatest among you is like the youngest. The greatest among you is like the servant. So then he turns that pyramid upside down. And then in the Gospel of John, we find him saying, I no longer call you servants. I call you friends. As if he says, look, a way of life could exist where we look at one another as equals and as peers. We call that democracy, right? So you see the hints of it in Jesus' teaching, but it took us a long time to get to a place where we could actually imagine and incarnate those ideas in institutions and in cultures.
I hadn't planned to go here next, but Alain, before bringing another question, I want to go back to what happened on that Utah campus. It seems like an opportune time.
Yeah.
One of the things Jesus and almost all the spiritual teachers talked about was not dehumanizing others. Jesus said, love your enemies, right? Which I don't think he literally meant have emotional love towards your enemies. I think he meant understand them, listen to them, put yourself in their shoes, right? What do you make of how do we get out of this dehumanizing, which doesn't even allow us to have conversations about the way forward that are thoughtful or helpful, right?
Yeah.
When we're now literally, now most of us are not killing each other, obviously, but this is the tip of the iceberg of what's under that is all the hatred and the language and the demonizing of everyone who disagrees with us. And, one of our previous guests said, Ronald Reagan once said, someone who agrees with you only 20% of the time is not your enemy. And someone who disagrees with you 80% of the time is not a traitor. But that's the world we live in. So how do we bring that humanizing that the traditions teach us into this? Because Brian, I don't know how we go forward, especially in the United States, but it's happening in other parts of the world, just with a different dynamic, less religious. How do we do this? And then we want to get more personal because you got some great ideas in the book about how we stay grounded. So maybe just a quick answer to that.
Well, this is where I think our faith communities, like a lot of people, give up on churches and synagogues and mosques and all the rest, but it's all there in our scriptures. There's versions of this that exist in the Quran, but certainly for Jews and Christians, this is deeply embedded in our scriptures. Same for Hindus and Buddhists and other religious traditions. But for those of us who are Christians, who are the largest religion in the world, if we're messed up, the whole world is messed up. We have to get enough Christians actually going and showing exactly what you said is in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, don't murder. But I say, don't call your brother a dehumanizing name. And if you even hate your brother, then you're setting the stage. Violence is inevitable if you go from internal hate to dehumanizing language. Eventually, you'll make your neighbor who you should love, your brother who you should be the keeper of, you will become the killer of. So that Jesus saw it. He taught it. It's one of our great treasures in the Christian religion. Sure would be nice. Why don't people teach that with it? Why aren't thousands of churches going to teach that this Sunday? Maybe they will, and we should celebrate and praise God if they do. But a lot of them won't do it because they support a president who constantly uses dehumanizing language, and they wouldn't want to ever say anything against their president. So look, we have to have courage. If we actually think Jesus is right as Christians, this would be a good time to show it in how we speak about it. There's a lot more, I think, because if churches don't do it, parents can do it. And if churches and parents don't do it, school teachers can do it. Like wherever people can do it, we should do it.
So Brian, maybe turning more to the personal side now. You write about the emotional weight of ecological collapse and how can grief become a generative force rather than a paralyzing one. And you also talk about the sweetness of grief. Can you share how grief has deepened your own spiritual practice?
Yes. Well, let me first say, my friend and colleague Richard Rohr wrote a beautiful book about this year that's called The Tears of Things. And he notices a pattern in the prophets where they start with anger. They're furious about injustice and hypocrisy and all the things we're talking about. And then very often they're their anger finally leads them to grief, because what they realize is things they love and cherish are passing away. Things they love and cherish are being destroyed and harmed. People they love and cherish are being harmed. And so anger leads to grief. And then we start to realize that at the center of grief is love. The reason we lament and are angry is because we have love. And in many ways, I think Richard is showing how, for all the ways that we talk about Jesus in the Christian faith, we have all kinds of theological discussions. We've sort of lost thinking of him as a prophet. And in many ways, a prophet is a person who takes us on that journey to caring about what's right and wrong enough that we get angry and then feel grief. And then that leads us to love. And this has been so much part of my journey, really my whole life in many different ways. But let's just take with the environment. I love the natural world, and there are specific places I love. And when you see places you love be less healthy, less ecologically diverse, or even disappear, it was a paradise and now it's a parking lot, to quote Joni Mitchell. You grieve. It breaks your heart. There was beauty there, and now there's an ugly strip mall where somebody can make money and buy lottery tickets. But you think, how many more of these do we need? For me, this has just been part of my life. I think I feel this now. It's not just natural places, it's institutions. I think about what public libraries have meant to me. And then I see people wanting to get rid of public libraries. I think about how great national parks and national forests are to preserve land. And then I see people just saying, oh no, we want to cut down the trees. That's just wasted money. It's wasted profit. And it just breaks my heart. And I feel anger and I feel sadness. And then I feel love. And then comes the challenge. Can I even then feel love for the misguided people who are leading the charge that's causing this harm? And that's what the place where I see that in the Gospels is when Jesus looks out at the crowds and he says, these are sheep without a shepherd. He feels compassion toward them. Interestingly, the religious fundamentalists of his time say, this damned crowd doesn't know the law. That's actually a phrase I believe it's in the Gospel of John. I think in the King James Bible, this crowd who doesn't know the law, a curse be upon them, which is saying, damn these people who don't understand the law. Well, we got to move beyond that to compassion and love.
Brian, one of the pieces of the book we're giving incredible short shrift to, because there's so much depth in there, is I found, especially the second half of the book, we think we spent a lot of time now on the first half of the book, where you talk a lot about spiritual in the broadest way, how we can spiritually get through this moment. There's some beautiful things in the book, or even around death and immortality and connecting to ourselves and to others and to life. But because we don't have a lot of time, I want to ask you a question that may be helpful to our listeners. Can you share a few daily or weekly practices that help you live with clarity and courage in this moment that we're in? Because if people are listening to this podcast, they're in the doom camp in one way or the other. I can tell you that. We got a lot of doomy people who listen to us. And I just mean by that, they're awake, they're alert.
Yes.
So they're concerned. So share just some things briefly that work for you that might be helpful for others. And again, please read the book, because there's a lot more in there on the spiritual side that's going to touch you, whether you're religious or not. But go ahead.
Well, let me first just say for folks, the way I define doom isn't that scenario 4, extinction is inevitable. The way I define doom is the psychological experience that we feel when we suddenly realize that our problems are bigger than our solutions. And when that feeling hits you, it creates a feeling of unknowing and helplessness, sometimes terror. And literally, many of us have never felt that way in our lives. So that's the experience. And so I'll say a couple of things that have helped me. First of all, having places where we can talk about it, like this podcast, helps a lot. If you're the only person in your family or your social setting that's thinking about these things, now you not only have the burden of facing some realities and feelings that you have and perceptions that you have to be honest about, but you're also alone and maybe even threatened, because if you were to tell people close to you that you care about these things, they would reject you or mock you or call you a name or something, and you would feel even more alienated. So finding some people, even just a couple of people that you can talk openly about, really helps. And I think podcasts become conversations that people can listen in on and say, I'm not the only one. So thank you to you guys for making this space available to people. On a personal level, I'll say two things. Getting some time outdoors every day, reconnecting with the beauty and the power and the rhythm and logic of nature, of creation, helps me. I have a little saying that I often say: humans are a mess, but the birds are being awesome. I see them migrating or flying or caring for their young or singing their songs, and something in me just says, this, thank God for that. That's one thing. And then another thing is, it's a great time for us to go in the deepest levels of honesty to prayer. A lot of people, prayer for them is asking for things. But I think there's a much deeper level of prayer, and that is where we hold our thoughts to the light, as the Quakers say. And that includes, I feel in despair right now. I just need to name this before the spirit, that the presence in whose presence I live, move, and have my being. So that would be those would be a couple of those practices that help me day to day.
When you said that, I thought about there's a saying in the desert monastic tradition: sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Yes. Not your cell phone. Sit in your cell. Just take time to reflect and ask. By the way, before we come to a close, and I'll ask you a quick final question, is please, if you're watching, listening us YouTube, Apple, wherever you are, please subscribe. It helps us so much to spread the word, and also helps you because you'll find out every time we have another episode or a short. Also, please make a comment. It means so much for us and for your fellow listeners and viewers to hear your comments. Engage. We'd love to hear from you. And go to our website, wayforwardpodcast.com, and connect with us. So please do that. Brian, one last question before I do a quick close. What gives you courage or hope right now, given all of this? And very briefly, we ask all our guests that. What's giving you hope amidst all of this?
Well, there's a chapter in the book, as you know, called "Hope is Complicated," and one of the things that really helps which really helped me in grappling with hope, is a quote from Václav Havel, and it's a good place for me to close. Václav Havel says, "Hope is not the certainty that things will turn out as we wish. Hope is the confidence that some things are worth doing, no matter how they turn out." And that sentence, I've sort of meditated on it, and it stayed with me. And what it does is it gives me an ability to admit something I know and I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know how I want to show up. And because I believe some things are worth doing no matter how they turn out. I think when we can get to that place, it gives us something in our heart. Courage is courage, something that flows from our heart. It gives us something from the heart that can't be easily defeated.
And, as I said that, I was thinking of something you said earlier. And can we also do that in love? There's so much, and again, in light of what happened yesterday in Utah, there's so much hate, even in those who are trying to save the world. And I think you make the point about that's not the way if it doesn't go well, that's not the way we want to go out.
Yeah.
We want to go out with love. We want to go out with big hearts. We want to go out seeing the beauty, as you talk in your book, that is abounding in humans as well, not just in nature, right? And so maybe that's a good place to end a beautiful conversation. Please read Brian's book. It will help you not just intellectually, but emotionally. And let's keep this conversation going. Meanwhile, we love you, our listeners. If you love what you heard, tell us. If you'd like us to do better, tell us. If you have some other topics you want us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. We always end this podcast by reminding you that the future is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. What one day we will call history will be the result of what we do to individually and collectively now in this present moment. So for now, we wish you a great day And we hope to see you next time on The Way Forward. And please do read Brian's book. It will help you. Bye now.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Their dedication to empowering elders to take action on climate change and social justice issues is truly inspiring. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. To learn more about our sponsors and get involved, visit Elders Action Network at eldersaction.org and Elders Climate Action at eldersclimateaction.org. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.